Nils Weidmann. I'm currently president of the Society for Intercultural Philosophy, and we're organizing this GiP lecture together with University of Tübingen. I particularly welcome Hora Zabarjadi Sar, who's giving the lecture tonight. Thank you very much, Hora, for accepting my invitation to talk to us tonight. I'd like to very briefly introduce Hora to you. Hora Zabarjadi Sar studied philosophy in Tehran, in Iran, before she moved to Australia and did her master's in education.
We're all aware that a violent mob murdered a police officer.
Sorry, can you turn off your, can you mute yourself? Okay. Anyone who's not muted yet, please mute yourself. That will be helpful. Okay. So she then went to Australia, University of Queensland, did her master in education at University of Queensland, and her PhD in philosophy at the University of Queensland, and finished her PhD just this summer. When she finished her PhD in the summer, she came to Tübingen and is now postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Intercultural and Interdisciplinary Studies here at Tübingen. And I'm very happy to have you here, Hora, and to have the chance to work with you. Hora has taught philosophy courses in Iran already, and as well in Australia at University of Queensland, and is now we're now teaching together with some more from Tübingen University as well as Bucharest and Athens. We're teaching together in a international doctoral class. Hora will talk tonight about Islamic feminism, the Iranian narrative. I'm very curious to learn more about this. Welcome everybody, and Hora, it's your floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels, for invitation first, for finding a time that I can share my work in progress. It's not a finished project. It's a personal passion and lots of years of conflict and reading and moving on. So it doesn't have any conclusion yet, but I'm going to share my thoughts and the way that I think the things can move on in the project of Islamic feminism with you. Actually, I'm going to give an overview of what exactly Islamic feminism and how it's different from the Iranian narrative. And actually, we don't have any one kind of a specific Iranian narrative. We have at least three approaches in feminism in Iran, but I'm going to focus on the Islamic feminist approach, or the Islamist feminist approach. I'm going to share my screen, I have some slides, and we can go through it. As Margaret Badran pointed out, feminism in the Middle East are more than a century old. There have been two major feminist paradigms referred to as secular feminism and Islamic feminism. The foundational moment of women's secular feminism may be traced to the late 19th century, while the emergence of Islamic feminism became evident in the late 20th century. These feminist approach appeared mainly in Muslim majority societies with plural religions and multiple ethnicities. They evolved in historical context in which new subjects and identities were being refashioned out of shifting combination of religious, class, ethnic, and national affiliation. When feminism first arose in the Middle East in the late 19th century and early 20th, countries were variously confronting Western imperialism and colonialism, declining Ottoman empowerment, and decaying dynasty rules. The region was experiencing uneven socioeconomic and technological transformation. Some segments of the population drew benefits from the swirls of change, while others first faced setbacks as they were left out on the loop of modernity and access to opportunities. For example, the Tanzimat reforms underway in Turkey from the middle of the 19th century and the constitutionalist movement in early 20th century Iran occasioned lively debate about religion and modernity. The Islamic reform movement began in late 19th century Egypt under the lead of Islamic modernist Muhammad Abdo, influential well beyond the borders of Egypt and even the region, calling for a revival of ijtihad, or independent investigation of religious texts, helping people face the challenge of how to be modern and Muslim. I'm going to focus on the idea of modernism a lot in this presentation, so bear with me. Meanwhile, the Arab Nahda movement, led by Christian and Muslims from Greater Syria, generated a broad movement of Arab intellectual and cultural revival. The discourse of national liberation, calling for the creation of an independent countries based on bonds of shared space and local culture, was the overriding discourse in Middle East countries. Under expanding Western colonial rule and decline Ottoman control. The new national identities in the making were not coterminous with religious affiliation as they were in Ottoman millet system. Secular nationalism visioned the construction of a new kind of collective identity, bonded by people's historical roots in shared territory and a common, if variegated, cultural experience. Within the imagined secular nation, religion was taken for granted and citizens' plural religious identities accorded recognition and space. So I'm now moving my focus on the debates that happened in Iran. Beginning with the constitutional revolution of 1906, modern Iran has witnessed massive female participation in educational and political processes. While many women supporting constitutionalists, they claim their citizenship rights in including enfranchisement and education. The first right delayed until 1963, but serious efforts of pioneering women to gain access to education was one of the major success of Iranian women in early 20th century. I name here Mozayyana Saltaneh, a tireless educationalist who established 3 all-girls schools in Tehran in a span of 3 years, 1912 to 1915, and was the editor and publisher of a journal between 1914 and 1918 named Shakufa, means blooming. One of the most important early women journalists who opposed unveiling and women's abandonment of hijab. However, as Afsaneh Najmabadi mentions, the rift between traditionalist and modernist women threw an important part of the modernist and counter-modernist discourses on women from the mid-19th century became consolidated into negating categories during Pahlavi regime. The adoption of European dresses, suits, jackets, and trousers, along with the design of a new hat called Pahlavi hat, for men in 1929 was used to distinguish modern, civilized Iranian men from their seemingly backward counterparts. In a similar manner, the veiled female body became the incarnation of cultural barbarism with the invention of a unified category of women victimized by local patriarchies and in need of emancipation. The signs of modernization were written on the body, as dress became the focal point of such identification. However, the lack of a civil society, combined with the imposition of a modern state from above and its violent insertion into daily life, intensified the gap between public and private patriarchy. The state had the state had a dualistic and contradictory approach to civil society. The model of modern masculinity thus defined itself through the othering of religiously defined masculinity. Masculinity was created as a site of a subject formation, as a site of a willing subjects in charge of both civilizing women and protecting the motherland. So Iran is the motherland, and Iran has a feminine name. So Iran is a feminine name. You can find girls' names called Iran. So it's a motherland. This moment was followed by the suppression of many forms of women's clothing, by the predominance of military dress for men, and by categorization of all men as soldiers ready to sacrifice their lives for the mother country, regardless of class, ethnicity, and the local political ties. The civic body made it possible for gendered citizenship to legitimate itself through law as incorporation and inscription. Through femininity, the law was connected to the essence of women's selves, consciences, and desires. It created continuity between a European civil code and an Islamic family code. In the post-revolutionary state, the law, which was exercised externally, became internalized as the essence of the female body. While unveiling was forced on respectable women, the state discouraged and even took initiative to prevent the unveiling of prostitutes. Now, public and private spheres became sharply separated and came to represent different interests within patriarchy. The new state-based patriarchs publicized their discourse, while the private patriarchs continued to protect their power in the private sphere, in those spaces where the state's access was either limited or contested, including religious spaces such as mosques. As a result, internal tension, contradiction, and antagonism between the public and private spheres continued to haunt the modernizing state during the revolution of 1979. Moreover, as a result of structural and cultural changes due to rapid urbanization and industrialization, as well as to failure of the nationalist and socialist movement, a new generation of educated young women and men from the middle and lower middle classes emerged with a religious zeal for making sense of the culture and society in which had been raised. A zeal that was grounded in popular culture. The generation of university students, composed of alienated men and women, discontented with social impression injustices, were concerned with finding a sense of identity and empowerment. This group played a peculiar and powerful role in the contemporary Islamic movement. What distinguished this generation of revolutionary Iranians was its adherence to militant political ideologies, which were constructed in a profoundly external, transnational, translational, and transactional relationship with other oppositional and revolutionary movements in other parts of the world, and particularly in the parts of the Middle East. As Minu Muallim noted, in the revolutionary and post-revolutionary era, 1979 and after, the body became a site of enunciation and agency through the association of its subjection and subordination with a quasi-colonial order. The civic body demarcated a field of action that defined women's political agency in terms of what was tolerable or intolerable with particular political frames of meaning. As sites of agency, these frames of meaning challenged Western liberal feminist notions of the free will of autonomous individual on behalf of a nationalist, anti-imperialist, socialist, or simply anti-dictatorship agendas. At a time of social upheaval and the revolution, the civic body became a site of hermeneutic activity, of revolutionary contestation and mimicry. Both dress code and warfare became frames for political activism, contestation, and reimagination of a femininity and masculinity. Like many other Islamists, the logic of revolutionary Iran sees the real threat of Western imperialism was less of a political, military, or economic hegemony, but more of a direct attempt to undermine religion and culture. I'm quoting an article. Colonialism was fully aware of the sensitive and vital role of women in the formation of an individual and human society. They considered her the best tool for subjugation of the nations. Women serve as the unconscious compliances of the powers to be in the destruction of indigenous culture. Woman is the best means of destroying the indigenous culture to benefit imperialists. This passage shows that how women issues have been center stage in defining the new order. Islamic revolution was successful in recognizing the woman's question, that is, in order for a revolution to occur, woman must be transformed in a way that the woman is marginalized, secondary, postponed, legitimate, and discredited became central, primary, immediate, and authentic. Women in sympathy for such recognition were placed in a position to take responsibility for the misogyny of the regime, to deny it, to challenge it, and to oppose it, not to ignore it though. While during Pahlavi dynasty, feminist activists were described by the opposition, Islamist or secular, to be at the service of the foreign colonial ventures, revolution legitimized activism and feminism as authentic and ironically open possibilities of growth in terms of the emergence of a new configuration of Islam and feminism. In early month of revolution, after revolution, in order to purify the willful sickness and the sickness of the will and remnant of the old regime, it was the woman's body to be purified, and forceful veiling was the remedy. In response to such misogynistic interpretation of Islamic notion of gender, women's defiance and resistance instantly named as counter-revolutionary. As counter-revolutionary resistant women lost the opportunity to build an alliance with Islamists, women activists of the revolution, and left in disbelief and shock of this unpredictable turn of the events. Out of those early years, though, there emerged an active drive toward rethinking gender in Islam. The result were various women's journals, which were attesting renegotiations, gender, and construction of womanhood. So, as I addressed earlier, we can mostly recognize three most important kind of approaches to gender discourses in Iran, even now. But I'm going to focus on the second one, religious, revisionist, reformist, or the Islamist feminist. There emerged different kind of journals. This is around 1990s. For example, Nida, the journal Nida, that means call, that belonged to Zahra Mustafavi. She was daughter of Khomeini. Ideologically rigid organ of quasi-governmental organization we have. And then it was the second one, Payam Hajar, the message of Hajar, that belongs to Azam Talaqani, figuring problems of working and rural women, women state employees, and other suffering sisters. That was protesting the voice of women's victimhood, and different ones. But the most important one, the fifth, it was the Journal of Zanan, that means women, belongs to Shahla Sherkat. Zanan has a powerful and articulate new voice, adopting Sufi language to describe the early years of women activism as days of enthusiasm, pain, turmoil, and passion to break down the ignorance, and that was the most important element of Zanan editorial article. Such language located Sherkat's Islam in Sufi tradition, which is considered as more spiritually religious than the Islam of clergy, observant of rigid rules and regulations. The editorial articles in Zanan called for awakening, which only plausible by going back to the depth of history to uncover the grounds of social beliefs in order to find the beginnings of the painful discriminations between men and women, and factors have consolidated that, and what factors that consolidated and constitute our social consciousness, which neither comes from religion nor is inhumane. The womanhood, which is constructed negatively from misogynistic stories of creation onward, enriched by the false promises of liberty. This narrative points then to the absence of women in present account of history and the necessity of a change in women's own consciousness, which is only possible in the state of freedom. Being free means to practice autonomy and having choice. The introduction of autonomy into Islamic discourse is of the significant innovation of Zanan. This was the first step in opening up a new discursive space for conversation between secular and Islamic feminism in Iran. So in the span of 4 years after this article, a new project embarked through radical interpretations of Islam and Islamic sources in regard to women's rights. Instead of implying the dominant method of reformist interpretations on women issues, which was using more women-friendly sources from an already existing set of authoritative exegetical texts, Zanan engaged in direct interpretations on her own right as ijtihad. They backed up this move on the ground that ijtihad is an obligation of any responsible adult, believer or non-believer. If a person follows the existing jurisprudence, arriving at a valid conclusion, even if they were not Muslim, the opinion is accepted. Such radical broadening the domain of interpretation led to the idea that not only new interpretations of Islam should be carried out on the light of contemporary school of philosophy and thought. The second method that Zanan implied in interpretation was based on new linguistic approach to the construction of the Arabic language as the language of sacred text. This was insisting on reading the Quran as a woman taking the linguistic venture in such engagement. Nowadays, they call it gendered reading of the holy text. Such direct approaching the text enabled the discussion on social construction of gender differences and drawing conclusions vastly different from the general accepted views about gender relations in Islamic society. One should note that at the heart of such individualistic ijtihad, or the interpretation of the sacred text, is a radical decentralization of a domain of interpretation from the clergy's narrative. There are several examples and books and articles available to see exactly how Zanan approached different somehow problems and issues that happens during, for example, 20-25 years, case by case, so you can follow it up. But the main question, and I think the main question of this presentation somehow emerged here, and that is how Islamist women movements, like what is portrayed in Zanan, came to realization of such innovative approaches to the sacred text and Sharia law. What made it possible for them to mesh their faith with their feminist tendencies and to cast their feminist-oriented demands within an Islamic framework. So we are going to move on to the next, or the second part, that I think all the dialogue and discussion will happen in this one. The Islamization of post-revolutionary Iran transpired at the intersection of political necessities, social realities, religious considerations, the legislative initiatives, as much as the Islamization project transformed society. This social transformation also reconfigured the meaning of the Sharia and expanded the boundaries of communities with interpretive authority over its legal injunctions. The Iranian post-revolutionary experience highlights the fallacies of bifurcated conceptions of religion and politics, and more specifically that of church and state. The post-revolutionary polity in Iran, soon after ratification of the constitution, came to a realization that Islamic criteria were a contentious set of regulatory principles rather than a given point of reference. Despite the state's coercive measures and imposition of stringent restrictions on public critical discourses of state policies, parliamentarians and influential clerics routinely introduced legal changes by responding to the practical difficulties of the applying Sharia. There are numerous examples how pragmatic social concern have continuously given rise to new interpretive and competing readings of Sharia. On the issues of private property, labor laws, music, sports, diet, women's rights, family planning, and a whole host of other issues, realities of social life have generated the space for unprecedented creative hermeneutical engagement with Sharia in Iran. As much as the Islamization project transformed society, it was the social transformation that figured the meaning of Sharia. Abdul Karim Soroush is without doubt one of the most influential figures among Islamic feminists. His radical discussion on what is essential in Islam and what is accidental has had great impact on some Muslim women, such as those in Zanan. Who is Soroush? Soroush tries with the social scientific efforts to identify the nature and role of religion in the post-traditional world. If you understand modernization as a process of progressive complexity and differentiation of institution and spheres of life under the influence of economic and technological advances associated with the advent of capitalism, secularization then would be an instance of modernization involving the differentiation of religion from economic and political institutions, namely separation of church and state. Secularization can also imply a separation of religion from culture and conscience. The two meanings of secularization can be expressed in dichotomy of objective versus subjective secularization. And reformation then alternatively refers to attempts on behalf of the religious to anticipate, adjust, or respond to the changes associated with objective and subjective secularization. Thus, according to our sociological definition, not every religious innovation would qualify as reformation or revitalization. If we can accept the two ways or two manners of secularization that has the has the sociological grounding, we can say we have two different secularization. One secularization from within and the other secularization from without. Modernization, secularization, and reformation have been indigenous to Western Christianity. Social thinkers didn't expect religion to survive the ineluctable forces of modernization and secularization. The founders of the sociology of religion, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and Georg Simmel, expected secularization to succeed not only in separating religion from the state, but also in eradicating it from culture and conscience altogether. The world, in their vision, would become increasingly and inescapably more rationalized, intellectualized, demystified, and disenchanted. They fail to anticipate religion's resilience and its ability to retrench and reinvent itself. Therefore, we can recognize three contours of new religiosity in the modern world. First one, the increasing compartmentalization of religion in the modern world as a result of secularization is foregone conclusion. Religion, in other words, has clearly lost its monopoly on public perception, morality, and conscience. Modernization and secularization had made religious exclusion or absorption of competing ways of life and belief nearly impossible. Second, secularization has socio-political and cultural or psychological aspects. The original meaning of the term secularization, that means removal of territory from control of the authorities, signifies the institutional separation of a church and a state. Social and political functions of the church are thus relegated to the other institutions. This stage of the process is understood as objective secularization. However, subjective secularization or profanation involves an infiltration of cultural practices and personal perceptions by the profane. Three, the new definition of religion takes seriously the desire of human beings for order, purpose, justice, and salvation. There are issues that founders of the sociology of religion neglected. Daniel Bell, for example, mentions human beings' universal need, existential need. Religion is anchored not in the need for social control and social integration, like Marx and Durkheim suggested, nor in the innate requirements of human nature, like what's suggested by Schleiermacher and Otto. Rather, it is rooted in the awareness of men of their finiteness and in the inexorable limits of their power, and the consequent effort to find a coherent answer to reconcile them to human condition. Contemporary sociology perceives religion as a set of coherent answers to the core existential questions that confront every human group. Thus, the social function of religion is no longer its sole explanation. But what about secularization? Let me say how Soroush can fit in with the first one. While this relationship between modernity and religion can be observed in Soroush's understanding of modernity, there is a significant and instructive difference. For modern sociologists of religion, the above conclusions are descriptive. Secularization is firmly in place, by profanation has not followed suit. Soroush's work, however, is prescriptive. He envisions the possibility and desirability of the secularization of an Islamic society without a concomitant profanation of its culture. It is not hard to imagine that in the Iranian intellectual milieu, such a doctrine would come under attack not only by the radical like modernist, but also by rejectionist revivalists. Neither can envisage separation of secularization and profanation, as we shall argue in the final part of this essay. Secularization from without. Whether modernization and secularization are foreign elements, we can expect three distinct reactions. First, there will be crusade to overcome the modern, in the name of preserving traditional identity and truth. And the second reaction to modernism and secularism may be described as reflective or reflexive revivalism, which aims not so much at overcoming the modern as accommodating. Reflexive revivalism acknowledges the force and sweep of modernization and secularization and shows a willingness to cast it as desirable and divinely preordained destiny. It thus tries to separate the universal, inevitable, and beneficial aspect of modernization and secularization from its culturally specific, imperialist, and then degenerate properties. The third reaction then is radical laical modernism that favors the wholesale surrender of the native culture and values to modernity. Soroush belongs to a relatively new and sophisticated brand of reflexive revivalism within Islam. Soroush's views of the forces of modernization and secularization, informed by Western history and theology, and influenced by revolutionary and reform movements in the Islamic world. But these are not only illustrative and instructive from an academic point of view, but are also capable of revolutionizing Muslim theology and mass religiosity. Soroush's main thesis has been that there are essentials, that in Farsi or Arabic we call it zati, in Islam that cannot be changed. Essentials of Islam are elements without which Islam is not Islam. There are yet others, which he calls accidental, that means arazi. They are the result of the special time and place when the Prophet of Islam was born and socialized. In 1996 interview with British Muslim Weekly, Q News International, Soroush asserted that all history is contingent, including this history of Islam. My criterion for separating the essentials and accidental of religion is knowledge that things could have been otherwise. Things that could have been happened otherwise are accidentals. For example, Tawheed, that is oneness of the God, is an essential because it could not have been otherwise. According to Soroush, it was an accidental of history that the Prophet was born in Arabia, and therefore the language of Islam is Arabic, something that, according to Soroush, significantly shaped the conceptual framework of Quran. Soroush's doctrine on accidental of history offers a radical critique of contemporary Islamic thought for mistaking the historically contingent forms of Islamic religion for its revealed essence, and for disregarding religious pluralism as the inevitable result of the reading of the revealed text in a specific human languages and socio-historical context. Soroush stresses that those who interpret Quran and other religious texts out of their historical context and only through their own understanding of the faith as the truth ultimately become religious depots who support the idea that Sharia is unchangeable. For him, rather than being a manifesto, the Sharia is silent. It is given choice by its exponents. The Sharia does not put forward immutable answers to predicaments of each historical moments. For example, according to Qamari Tabrizi, Soroush transformed Sharia from preconvinced dogma into perpetually rearticulated and contexted text. Soroush argues that any claim to the absolute truth of Islam transforms it from religion to ideology. Ideologization of religion, beside hypocrisy, are the plagues. Ideologization of religion turns it into an instrument of fanaticism and hatred. Ideology attains its objective through hatred, and thus a pluralistic society is a non-ideological one, a society without an official interpretation and interpreters, a society which is founded on plural reason and pluralist reason. Although Soroush has never been a radical fighter of women's rights, but his theory of expansion of prophetic experience and his formulation of accidental history and social pluralism established a profound basis for Islamic feminists. Recently, Dr. Sadiqeh Wasmaqi gave a striking talk on Islam and feminism, inquiring about whether the Islam as we know today essentially tolerates and accepts the feminist demands or not. She believes that Islamic feminism is not an appropriate combination, as here we talk about a feminism which is bound to Islam. What is known as Islam is a traditionalist account that is reduced to fiqh, or the Sharia law. Such an account of Islam will never accept even the very basic demands of feminism. We still can talk about Muslim feminists, though, as someone who fights for the feminist demands in the Islamic society. Any social movement that looks for sustainable reforms in society should start with this traditional account of Islam as Sharia, and undermining and staking it for the purpose of critique. We don't believe that history of Islam is equal to Islam per se. Whatever we receive from the history is the accumulation of the events, accumulation of beliefs, the tradition that we took it for granted as the Islam itself. Take, for example, Sunnah of the Prophet. Sunnah is the way of living, the manner of living the Prophet. What is Sunnah? What we know as Sunnah is the words, the deeds, and whatever the Prophet established as regulations. This is what apostles taught us as Sunnah. Whatever is given historically should be evaluated accordingly. We cannot take them as unchangeable pure truth only because they pointed to some words and deeds of the prophets and imams. Even when the whole idea of morality is embedded in what Sharia knows as good and evil, there will remain no room to suggest that we may reflect on women's condition morally and ask the patriarchal system to give the fair share of women's rights as human rights. What Islamic Sharia tells about women cannot be considered as what Islam believes about women. Sharia deviated from the original message of Islam, and it is the responsibility of Muslim intellectuals to correct this deviation. Here, as we can see, Dr. Wasmaqi calls for a new speculation of Islam, the one which transcends Sharia and fiqh. It is only on this condition that we can think of an opening toward the woman's condition. And I'm going to conclude and pose an important question. Abdul Karim Soroush distinguishes between two kinds of Islam: Islam of identity and Islam of truth. Islam of identity is a form of cultural identity, which is a response to the crisis of identity. Islam of truth, therefore, refers to Islam as a repository of truth and point toward the path of worldly and otherworldly salvation. The Prophet of Islam was a messenger of those truths. Divine messengers and prophets originally invited people to those series of truths pointing toward salvation. As people accepted those truths and religious disciplines that contained them, they gradually developed identities. It is the plague of Islam and Islamic world that people gradually coming to understand Islam as identity rather than truth. He believes that the Islam of identity should yield to the Islam of truth. The latter can coexist with other truths. The former, however, is by its very nature belligerent and bellicose. It is the Islam of war, not the Islam of peace. Two identities would fight each other, while two truths would cooperate. I believe that the manner in which Iranian intellectuals like Soroush and Wasmaqi tackles, and many of others that I don't name it here, tackles the problematic of fiqh and the Prophet's Sunnah in a unique way, as they try to introduce new types of identity of a Muslim woman. Although Islamic feminism claims that they criticize the Islamic patriarchy by historicizing and reinterpreting sources of scriptural authority, they never really engaged with the notion of Muslim woman's identity in this process. Desacralization and detraditionalization of gender relations and creating a hybrid form of discursive religious tradition essentially challenges the very woman's religious identity. Such an engagement is a long process of reappropriation and reinterpretation of what we know as Islam. Then we should ask, can we really practice Islam then? This would be a totally new premise to be discovered. Thank you.
Thank you, Hora.
You're welcome. I stop sharing now.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot.
Welcome.